Okay, so let's continue. We are going to start the next 2 slides pending from last time. We'll start the next chapter, which is going to be on file systems. So before we do that, we will do our Tuesday or Thursday parable. This one is on the economist, the statistician, and the mathematician. There's no computer scientist here, but you can guess who is the computer scientist. Okay, so the story goes that the 3 of them are on a train and in a new country, and they see a black cow in a field. And the economist says, look, a black cow. So all cows in this country are black. And then the statistician says, not so fast, that's incorrect. All you can say is there is a field in this country where there is at least one cow that is black. And then the mathematician says, that is not at all true. All you can say is there's at least one field in this country where there's at least one cow which is black on the left side. What that says is you should be careful of your assumptions. I had a parable where the moral was pick your project partners carefully, but I thought that may be a bit too late for lab 2 So we will continue our discussion. There are 2 slides from last class. So we were talking about memory management, specifically page replacement algorithms. We did random 5-4 bin LRU. Last time I showed you something called Baladi's anomaly. It said as you add memory to processes, there are certain page replacement algorithms that behave worse. Okay, kind of completely counterintuitive. Clearly, you don't want to use such algorithms in operating system. I said LRU actually does not have Baladi's anomaly. Then we spent much of the class talking about approximations to LRU. Because LRU is expensive to implement. And towards the end of the class, I was talking about multi-programming and thrashing. Okay, thrashing is a scenario where memory is overcommitted and process is continuously page faulting. Okay, the right way to get around thrashing is to look at the working set of the process. A working set is the set of pages the process is currently working on, and ensure that you give it at least that much memory. Okay. And so if you have at least as many page frames as your working set, you are going to not page fault as frequently, and your performance will be good. Okay, so that is basically where we left it off, and then here's some couple of more things to discuss. One is page sizes. Okay. So I did mention this some time back, and I just wanted to bring this back. We have assumed that page sizes are in the 1 to 4K range. Obviously, there is nothing that prevents an OS from choosing whatever page size it wants for its memory management. Okay, so just to understand the trade-offs, if you choose a small page size, okay, you will get more effective memory use because you will have less internal fragmentation, better use of your memory overall. Larger degree of multi-programming may be possible because there are more pages to go around. Same amount of RAM, but more pages. And presumably you can then have more processes to share those pages. Okay? And the other end of the spectrum, if you have very large page sizes, you get small page tables. Okay? Because there are only that many pages to go around. So the page table will shrink. Okay? You will have better amortization of your page fault overheads over the execution, because every time you page fault, you read a larger chunk of memory, and then that page is also bigger, so you will have fewer pages. So you are going to amortize your page fault overhead over a larger page. You might have fewer page faults because there are fewer pages to go around. Okay? So those are the trade-offs between large and small. And the thing to keep in mind is because physical RAM is increasing in size, right? And also because CPU speeds are also increasing faster, and specifically they are increasing faster than disk speeds. Overall page sizes have been growing. Okay? So it's not uncommon to now see 8K pages, right? Which is a doubling of the page size. And that's because you have more RAM, so then you can increase the page size and not have much larger page tables and so on. And as the CPU speed increases, the cost of the relative cost of a page fault goes up because you have more instructions executing in a shorter amount of time, and then a large page fault. Then you take to suspend the process. So having bigger pages helps in that. Okay, so these are trade-offs to keep in mind as far as choosing the right page size is concerned. The very last slide on memory management is on kernel memory allocation. Thus far, everything we have talked about has been from the perspective of allocating memory to our user processes. Okay, so now the kernel also needs to do its own memory management. Okay, the kernel is a process, and in this case, it has to manage its own memory. Okay. Now, just as if you write a C program, you can do a malloc and dynamically allocate memory, so can the kernel. Okay, the size of the kernel will grow and shrink. For instance, as you have more processes, the number of PCB entries is going to grow. The PCB list is not pre-allocated, okay, because it dynamically grows as you start up new processes. Okay, so how does it grow? You have to allocate more memory. Okay, so most kernels will actually have a kernel implementation of malloc. Okay, if you are writing a kernel, you can't call malloc, because malloc is a C library function. The kernel doesn't know what malloc is. So you actually, in Linux, for instance, you will have kmalloc, which is the kernel's implementation of malloc for itself. Yes, question.
I just had a question. When the kernel is reading in a program returning to a process,
Yep.
and for instance in a Java program, does it read in all the news and allocate that when it creates a process, or are those the same as malloc, or they're allocated afterwards?
So what is
For instance, like create a new object in a method in Java.
Right.
Is that read in at the start or at later on?
Okay, so there are probably two aspects to your question. There is, in the process, there is the code segment, right? There is the stack, and there is the heap. Stack works one another. So as far as the code is concerned, whatever code you have written will be read in, and if you are doing demand paging, it will be read in on demand. Okay, so whether it's to allocate a new map. So what happens is you allocate this address space for the stack and the heap segment, but you are not actually assigned page frames. So some of this memory is empty. In a sense, there's a space here, but it's not allocated to it. As you actually do malloc, and let's say the size of the heap grows, this is when actually a new page is allocated to the process. Okay, so some parts, so this is how the process grows and shrinks at all. So address space is fixed. This is the max size of the address space, but then parts of it may be empty. There's a big hole in there, it's not allocated to this empty space. And then the stack and the heap will grow and shrink. Okay, so that's how, is that what you were asking?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay, so now as far as the kernel goes, the kernel, as I said, doesn't have the luxury of calling C library function. It has to implement everything itself. Libraries are written for users, okay, not for kernel. So kernel has to implement its own memory allocators. Here are just two that are examples of one. There's a simple one called buddy allocator, which allocates memory in sizes of 2 to the power n. And so that basically the reason, so even though you may want to allocate a PCB of size, let's say 58 bytes, it is going to allocate memory in chunks of 2 to the power n. So it's going to round it up to the next 2 to the power n and allocate it. The reason for this is you don't want internal fragmentation inside the kernel. Yeah, the kernel is paged, but the heap is actually going to grow and shrink, the kernel heap. So you want to ensure that you can do this in a reasonable way, which is why you put some restriction. If you're doing user level malloc, you can ask for an object of size X, and you will get an object of size X. And in kernels, you don't have that luxury, so you want to reduce some. The other one is called a slab allocator. So here, what you do is, and malloc, the implementations of malloc also use slab allocation. Okay. So what happens in a slab allocator is you actually allocate memory in larger sized chunks, but then you use those chunks and partition the objects in those chunks. So if you want, let's say, so if you want to allocate a struct, you can allocate an entire page dynamically. So that's the simplest thing to do. And then chop that page up and say, this is assigned to object O. And the next time you do malloc, you're not going to allocate a new piece of memory. You take this unused piece and say, I'm just going to allocate some part of that. So here is object, and so on and so forth. So what the memory allocator will do is it will allocate a larger chunk, let's say a page at a time, or some number of pages at a time, and then chop those up into individual objects and hand them out. Okay? This simplifies how you do memory allocation. It also eliminates the need to allocate arbitrary sized chunks, because you are allocating logically, you are allocating pages, but then you chop that up into object size. Okay? So you have to play these kinds of tricks to avoid problems with respect to fragmentation and things like this.
Sorry, I'm just going to make sure I'm understanding the vocabulary. The bigger chunk you were just talking about would be a slab.
Yes, in this case, the bigger chunk would be a slab.
And so when you said object cache can point to one or more slabs, that means you could have an object that will span across two slabs?
Yes, so what might happen is, so I didn't actually talk about the object cache at all. So if you allocate that this is the first slab, which is, let's say, a page, and have the second slab. And then if you have some space left over here and now, if you want to allocate an object, you can have this kind of.
Okay.
So then you can have a cache that basically points to where. That's mostly a metadata structure, which we don't have to worry about here. But that's really what it is saying. So you can have objects. Objects can be larger than slabs. Objects can span slabs. Objects can be smaller than slabs. Because we don't control what the size of an object is.
So,
Just let me finish that. Follow-ups.
I was just going to say, so the object cache tells you where the object's stored, and the kernel stores the object cache itself somewhere?
Somewhere in the kernel. Yes, exactly. So it's a metadata for where your allocated pages dynamically. Yes.
kind of confused, so are these objects like part of like the heap? Like is this just like object data from like a specific process?
Yes, so the kernel, think of it as kernel. We are talking about allocating memory for the kernel itself, not user processes. And the first takeaway is the kernel has to manage its own memory. Nobody else is going to do it for the kernel. The second is you have to do it slightly differently. So this is how you would manage the kernel heap. Yes, although you may not even call it the heap for the kernel, but that's the way to think about it.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, so with that, we will end the discussion on memory management. And we are going to switch to the next topic, which is going to be on storage and I/O systems. Okay, so today we'll start with the file system, and we'll do this in layers. Okay, so we are done with this, just to see where we are. We did processes and threads and the hardware resource that we were concerned about the CPU. We just finished this component, which is the address space of a process and the hardware resources memory. Now we are going to talk about the file abstraction and the file system abstraction. And then the hardware resource we will be concerned about is the disk. Okay, so that's where we are. So we will go in steps. So this is sort of the layers that you see in the kernel as far as I/O management is concerned. Okay, this is now only one type of I/O device, which is the disk. Okay. So in this topic, we'll first start with the disk as a particular representative I/O device. We will see how the OS manages disk as an I/O device. We'll see what kinds of abstractions are provided, is the file system abstraction and so on. And then at a later point, we'll just look at I/O devices in general. Okay, what do device drivers do? Because we have to do the same stuff for any arbitrary I/O device. Right now, we are only going to look at one, which is the disk. Later on, we'll talk about other I/O devices. Okay. Now, as you can see, there is a set of layers in the kernel that depend on how you deal with the device. Okay, so at the very top are your application, and then there's a programmer interface. This is really the system call interface that user processes use to communicate with an I/O device. Okay, so in this case, we just system call interface defaults to the files, so file level system calls, and we'll talk about it. Okay. What happens inside the kernel is once these calls come in, you have to translate them to disk level operations. Whether you're opening a file, closing a file, creating directories, deleting files, those translate to underlying disk level operation. Okay, so there's another layer that is actually going to translate whatever you're trying to do into I/O for the disk, which may read some chunk to the disk, modify a chunk, write it back, whatever it is. By chunk we mean disk blocks. Okay. So in today's class we are going to look at this layer, okay, how the file system interface works. Next time we'll sort of go one level down and start looking at this, saying, how do these operations translate to disk operations and file operations on disk and so on. Okay? So that's how we are going to proceed. Okay, so now for today we are not going to look at underlying aspects of the disk. So we'll just assume disk is a storage device. We'll not actually think about how is the physical disk going to work, how do you actually go retrieve data and so on. All that is hidden from us at the moment. We'll use just an abstraction of a storage device in this case. Okay. So let's start with thinking about data that you store on any storage device. Okay. So there are certain requirements. In this case, there are some assumptions that you as a user have made or are led to believe is going to happen with your data. First one is persistence. Okay. What this says is if you put some data on your storage device, you expect it to be there across power reboots. Right? The memory contents are volatile. So the assumption is disk is a non-volatile medium. It's a persistent medium. Any data you write to disk is going to stay there. Okay? You can shut down your machine, come back to it a week later, the data isn't gone away. Okay, so data stays around between jobs and power cycles and so on. Okay. Another assumption is speed. The general assumption is that if your OS is well written and the file system is well written, you can get to your data quickly. Your system is responsive. You try to read a file, it reads it fairly in a reasonable time frame. Okay, what is quick, we will just leave that as a relative term for it. Okay. Size is the third assumption. So you assume that your disks are large, so you can store large amounts of data. Typically now you get a 1 terabyte disk for a PC for less than $100. That's so barely few pennies a gigabyte. And that's a very low cost for storing data. Okay, so the assumption is, and then you basically create gigabytes and gigabytes of data and not actually have to worry about running out of storage space on a typical PC because now you have terabytes of data available. Okay, so store lots of data, sharing and protection. If you want to share your data with some other users who's accessing the same system, you can. The file system will allow you ways to either share data or explicitly not share data. If you think some data is private, then you can make that private as well. Okay? And last but not least, ease of use. Okay, this is an important point. The abstraction that the OS is providing to you hides lots of the underlying details. Okay, if you create a file, you don't have to worry about where is it stored on disk, how is it laid out, how do you get to it. You just access that file using the name. Okay, so you can assign whatever name you like, so you can remember what name you gave to that file. And all this comes down to ease of use. Next time when we talk about the actual layout on disk, we will see that there are lots of underlying data structures and details. All of that is hidden from the user. The OS takes care of all of the details. Okay, so going back to the very first class when I said the OS takes care of lots of these details for you, this is an important concept in storage systems. Okay. Now, as far as, so these are the requirements. So as far as the hardware is concerned, it meets the first three, and the OS has to actually deal with the other two. Okay, so if you take a typical magnetic disk or a solid state disk, okay, the hardware provides you persistence. So anything you put on it, the hardware guarantees stays there. It provides you speed because it allows you random access, unlike some early versions of storage that were sequential access. Most disks are random access to us. You can go to any location on the disk and read data. That's what we mean by speed. Okay? And size. The disks keep getting bigger. I missed a zero there. Typical disk these days on a PC can be, at least the biggest ones are 2 terabytes. Okay? So that's what you can actually buy today. That's not 200 or 2,000 gigabytes. As far as the OS is concerned, it has to also deal with some notion of persistence. And here the persistence basically says that if you have corruption on the file system, the OS will take care of repairing the file system for you and so on, so that your data doesn't get lost. Sharing and protection is provided to read, write, execute privileges. We look at that. Ease of use, there are a whole bunch of features that the OS provides you. Okay? It allows you to create file names, associate names to files. It allows you to group files into directories and have a directory and subdirectory structure, so you can keep related files together. It transparently maps files to the locations on disk. It even allows you to search. So even if you say I created this file, I don't remember its name, you can now actually search through your entire system. Most operating system will actually do that for you. Okay? So we'll go through this one at a time. We'll start with files first. Then look at some how protection and all these other features are anyway. Okay? So let's start with the definition of a file. You all know what a file is. As far as our course is concerned, the formal definition, it's a logical container of data. It's a logical unit of storage that is kept on some storage device. Typically, this is a more formal definition, which is a named collection of related information. Okay, so just a fancy way of saying it's a container of data that you have a name associated with. The name is given by users. Okay. As we will see next class, internally these names don't mean anything to the file system or the OS. Internally, files are actually numbered. Okay, so when you give it a name, there's a mapping that the OS performs that takes the file name and maps it to a unique number. Okay, so all files, each file has a unique number in the file inside the file system. Yes.
It can't store as hex, but it still has a file extension.
I'm sorry.
I've seen like the number actually stored in hex, but it has the file extension, despite the fact that there's a name. So even at space level, it still has like a human readable file extension.
So the file extension, so what I mean by numbers are something else. There are things called inodes, and inodes have numbers. So internally, the OS is actually going to refer to files by their number. Okay, if you just want to, so extensions are different, and I didn't mean that this string is actually stored as an ID. That's not what I meant at all. I just, if you want to see what I meant, what you can do is if you actually go and do ls minus I, okay, on a directory, you will see the ID of a file. That's the unique number for the file. That has nothing to do with the name. Okay, that's just the internal ID that is associated with the file. Okay. So names are just for human convenience. Okay. So you decide what the name is so you can get back to your file at a later point. A couple of other points. First is, as far as the OS is concerned, it doesn't actually worry about what is inside a file. You can store whatever you want, whether it's binary data, whether it's text, whether it's something else, it doesn't matter. Okay, just a container of data, you can store whatever you want. But as far as the file system is concerned, there are two types of files, okay, structured or unstructured. Okay? And there are competing philosophies in file system design. Okay? Unix typically assumes that the file is basically a sequence of, uninterpreted sequence of bytes. Typical Unix file systems actually don't worry about what is inside the file or the structure of a file. But there are other types of file systems where the file is actually structured. You will say that this file is a collection of records. Each record is X bytes in size. Okay? These types of file systems exist. And initially these file systems are designed to implement or to optimize for database storage on disks. The databases, as you know, have tables, and tables have records, and records are typically a fixed length. Here, to efficiently implement databases, there were actually file systems that were designed just for that purpose, and they were structured. Yeah, they actually had each file was a collection of records. You couldn't arbitrarily put any bytes you want. You have to organize that files as records and so on. Okay. So files could be structured or unstructured. Today, most general purpose file systems are unstructured. They just assume it's a container of data. The file system doesn't impose any structure. You can store whatever you want in the file. Okay. And then there are file attributes. Every file has a name, it has a type, location, and so on. Okay. Now this is another important one. Okay. There are many file systems that do not associate a type with a file. Okay. The file name is not interpreted. Okay. You could say this is file lecture2.powerpoint. And that .ppt is not interpreted by the file system. And there are other file systems that actually look at the extension of the file type and associate a meaning with it. And Unix file systems typically don't. If you take Windows and Mac, they do. Okay, so if you actually go to any file on Macs, for instance, let's just look at one. So let's just take this file, which is the recording. So you will see that the file system actually is associated a type with the file, and it even associates what application to use. If I click on the file and open it, all this is actually stored in the file system. Okay, so it is storing not so. You can just use the extension, or you can actually have additional metadata that stores all sorts of information. Yes, question.
So what you're saying is that that's actually stored in the file system on Mac, but I mean, you could do the same thing on, I don't know about straight up Unix, but I know on Linux.
So in Linux, what happens
will
is,
open,
if you actually run GNOME or KDE and you double click on something, it does open an application. But that information is actually not inside the file system. That is stored outside the file system by the Windows desktop interface, and it has associated extensions with applications. So it is just blindly looking at the extension and saying, if you have a file with this extension, you double click on it, use this application and open it. That's all it is doing. Okay? But that information is not inside the file system. In this case, this is actually going,
doesn't it?
it depends on what version of files, which file system you're talking about.
Okay.
Typically, you will see that there is information in the file itself, in the file metadata itself that keeps this, and sometimes it's kept outside. So if you don't have it in the file system, and you want to do things like that, you have to keep it outside, but it has to be kept somewhere.
Okay.
So files could be typed or not typed. Okay, so typically, if you have plain vanilla Unix file system, they're untyped. If I don't have type, and if you want to associate types, you have to do it outside the file system. Okay. So with that background, let's now look at some file operations and see how to go about implementing. Okay, so typical operations you will do on files are open a file, create a file, delete file, and so on. These are system calls. Okay, if you remember when we talked about system calls, I said typically when you write programs, you don't write code at this level. Okay, you are going to use the Java library or C library, the C, you may use file open and so on. Those translate to these underlying system calls. And then there are a bunch of others that these manipulate files, these other system calls manipulate the metadata of it. We can change the attributes and so on, and we'll talk about those as well. Okay, so let's start with some of these operations and just quickly look at how do you implement. If you are writing a file system, what would you do? How would you implement those system calls? Okay. So two data structures to keep in mind. Okay. First one is called an open file table. The other one is a per process file table. So these are in-memory data structures. Okay. It's very important to keep in mind that next class I'm going to talk about file metadata. Those are on-disk data structures. Okay. Two completely different things. Okay. These are data structures that the kernel keeps in memory about what files are open and so on. There are other data structures the file system actually maintains on disk. Okay, so, and those never go away. Okay, if you reboot, they will still be on disk. These will actually get wiped out because they are in RAM. Okay. Open file table is basically a table that says what are all the files that are currently open by any process. Okay. Per process file table just does the same thing for each process. So these are all PCB entries in some sense. It says what is open, who or which files are open, and what file descriptors are associated with it, and so on. Okay. So let's start with the first system call, which is create. So the way you call this is just say create and give and define the name of a file, and then the OS is supposed to go create that file. Okay. So the way these are the steps you perform. So you need to first check if there is sufficient disk space. If you're out of space, you give an errors and can't create any file. You actually also have to check if your file entry, okay, which is an inode, which we are not yet talking about. If you're out of inodes also, you will give an error. Okay, but for now, we won't worry about it. Okay, so you create a file descriptor for the file on disk. Okay. Then you have to add that file descriptor to the directory, okay, that this file is resident in. Because all files, each file belongs to some directory. Okay, yeah. So once you create a file, you have to add it to the directory, so that's where now you're going to get to the file. Okay. Then if you have a particular type file system, you will associate a type with the file, depending on what you do. Okay. And as I said, there are advantages and disadvantages. If you have types associated with files, the biggest advantage is your default operation. If you double click on an icon of that file, the OS knows what application to open. So that's a convenience as far as users are concerned. Okay, the disadvantage is it makes the file system more complex. The file system needs to know about every possible type of file, what to do when the user tries to open that file. And this mapping has to be maintained in the file system or actually has to be associated with every single file. Okay. And as I already mentioned, Unix opts for simplicity. The file system is untyped. Macs and Windows actually have types associated with it. And as was also pointed out, since Linux is a variant of Unix, the underlying file system is not typed, but then the types are maintained outside the file system, typically by the windowing interface. Okay, so create is very simple, and so is delete. Okay, when you delete a file, you just delete the entry from the directory, you delete the blocks of the file, and you just free them up. By delete, you don't actually do anything to the blocks, you just go and put them on a free block list. And these blocks are available for allocation. Okay? And you remove the descriptor from the directory. Okay? Now what this should tell you is that there is some similarity between allocating pages to a process and allocating blocks to a file. Okay? In both cases you are managing some space. Okay? In one case you are managing memory, in another case you are managing disk blocks. Okay? And we'll talk about doing contiguous allocation and non-contiguous allocation of disks next time. The same kinds of issues will crop up again. Yes, but this should sort of tell you that what a directory is almost like a data structure that holds the index. The index is like a page table, as we'll see next time. Okay. So create and delete are very straightforward operation. Now let's look at open, close, read and write, where you have to do a little more work. Okay. So suppose there's a file on disk, we try to open it. Okay. The open system call has actually two key arguments, some others were two key ones, which is the name of the file that you are trying to open and the mode you are trying to open it. You can open a file in read mode, write mode, or read-write mode. Yeah, sometimes it's append mode as well. Okay. So if you want to open the file, first you have to check, is this file already open? Okay, some other process has it opened it, in which case there is not much to do. Okay, you basically already have an entry in your global file descriptor table. They're just going to use that entry and make it available to this process. Okay. So if it's already open, copy the file descriptor from the system-wide table to the per process table, you're done. Okay. So you also have to check for the protection bits on that file. If a process is trying to open a file, you have to check, is the process allowed to do it? If the process is not allowed to do it, then you have to give an error. If you're trying to open a file in write mode, but you cannot write to the file, then you will have to give an error. Okay. We'll increment the open count, and I'll talk about why you need that. Okay. And then you basically initialize the file. Okay. You are going to create an entry in the per process table and initialize the file pointer to the 0th byte of the file. Okay. Because that's where you start reading. Okay. So what this is showing you is this is basically a pseudocode that shows implementation of the open system call in the file system. Every file system that you have support for has to implement these operations. Okay. Today I won't talk about what is called the virtual file system switch. The way typically open call works is the system call comes in. Okay. The kernel actually looks at where is the file actually stored, which device is it stored on. And depending on what file system is on that device, it is going to call the right file system code. Typical kernels may support more than one file system. Okay. Simple example is you will have always support for the FAT file system. If you have a USB key or some such thing, and you may have NTFS or Mac has HFS, and or you might have ext3 or ext4 on Linux. Okay. So if you take any OS kernel, it may actually have support for easily half a dozen to a dozen different file systems. Every file system has to implement its own version of open, because only that file system understands how the data is stored and so on. Your question? Yes.
I think this is probably a question for a day from now, but RAID, I'm
Yes.
assuming falls under the same category where it's just one layer below that, whether or not it's,
So we'll come to RAID. RAID is actually how the storage is organized across multiple disks. We will talk about it 2 classes from now. Okay. And so that is even below the file system. That is how your storage is organized on hardware. Okay. So this is the interface. Then you have the file system and then your devices and that. Any other questions? So this is the implementation of the open. Okay. Close is very simple. You are going to remove the entry from the per process table. You are going to decrement the count. The count goes to 0, it says that no other process ref count goes to 0, it says no other process has the file open, so you delete it from the system-wide file table, and you're done. Okay? So you might ask a question, why do you need this system? Two data structures. You have a file table for the entire system and you have a per process file table. You'll ask the question, why do we need? Is it redundant? Are they duplicating information? What do you need it for? Okay, so the first data structure holds a global list of all files that are open for reading or writing by any process in the system. The second data structure stores information on what this process is actually doing, which files does it have open. So why do you need both? Why not just have one?
For protection for one, right? I mean, we wouldn't want processes to be able to alter data in a file that they don't have permission to alter.
Fine. So you can do better protection. So let me ask the question some other way. Why do you need this? Why not just have that? Right? So one data structure for one entry per file, regardless of which process is accessing. Yes,
I,
yes,
I,
yes.
I think it might give separate processes that's opening the same file to be able to modify their own section.
Yes.
That doesn't get affected back and forth.
Okay. You have something to say? Something else to say? Yes.
Well, a lot of the information that's stored in the per process file table, the current offset, the mode in which the process accesses the file, any pointers to its file buffer are going to be separate per process. So if two processes have the same file open and one of them reads the file, its current offset is going to move. But you don't remove the current offset of the other process that has the file open. It doesn't want to wake up and all of a sudden find that its offset's in a different position.
Right.
So
So-
you have to store all that.
So what is being pointed out is that there is process state as far as each file is concerned. This is what this process is doing with respect to that file. So process B may open this file and it will be reading the file at this location. Process A may open the file and it will be reading the file at this location. That is per process information. The file is common across the processes, but they are actually reading or writing different portions of the file. And that particular state is captured in the per process file table. So there's a current position in the file. That's the per process thing. There's a mode in which a process is accessing the file. This process may have opened the file in write mode. And this one may have just done in read mode. Okay. So you have to keep all this information somewhere, and that is stored in the per process file. Now, why do you need the global file table? Because it has, as you can see, some information about the file itself that is common. Who is the owner of the file, and so on and so forth. Okay. This is something I read from the disk. It's in the file system. You read that copy and brought it in. That's common. So if some other process tries to open the file, you don't have to go to read to disk to reread that metadata. There's a copy already in disk. You can check who is the owner, what are the ownership permissions, and so on. You can check that from this global file table. Okay. And so that is going to be common independent of what the process is doing. The owner of the file will not be different depending on the process. It's always going to be the same. So you need to keep these two data structures for different reasons. One shows common information about the file that you can use when you start doing operations. The other one stores per process state that is specific to the file. Yeah, so that is the reason to have this system-wide table, and then you have per process table. So there are different things maintained in those data structure. They are not redundant. Okay. So read and write are also fairly straightforward. Yes, once you open the file, you can start reading or writing. Yeah, so typically when you say read, you give the file descriptor. You say this is the offset I want to read, this is the amount of data I want to read, and you give a buffer. Okay, so you might have a read call that looks like this. So you say read, this is the file descriptor. That's all. Once you open a file, okay, open is going to actually return to your file descriptor. Okay, so what it comes back from open is a file descriptor. When you open a file, you specify the name, you get a descriptor. From that point on, you use a file descriptor to access that file. You don't specify the name. So here you're just going to give the descriptor, say, right, this is the offset. So take position 10224 and then read 10 bytes from it and read it into this buffer. Okay, that buffer better with at least 10 bytes inside. Okay. What the read call is going to do is actually going to go into the file, read that chunk of data from the disk, okay, and then it is going to copy that data from that file chunk into the buffer. Okay. And as we will see next time, okay, I/O operations to disks are actually going to be in granularity of disk blocks. Okay, so they will see, just as you had memory pages, you are going to have something called disk blocks. You can only read or write in multiples of disk blocks. Okay. But as far as the read system call is concerned, you can read arbitrary chunks. You can read 1 byte, you can read 10,000 bytes, independent of what the size of the disk block is. Okay. The OS has to deal with all the hardware. Okay, let's take a case where you are actually reading only 1 byte from the beginning of the file. Okay, so 0, 1 in the buffer. Okay, so you issue a read call, say read 1 byte from the beginning of this file. Okay. What the OS will do is it will get this request, it will go read the first block of the file. It cannot actually read 1 byte from disk, if the disk won't allow it. The file system is going to only allow you to read chunks of a block. A typical block size is 4K. Okay. So the OS is actually going to read an entire block, 4 kilobytes, even though the user requested 1 byte. It is going to store this into something called the buffer cache. From that cache, it's going to take the first byte of this block and then stick it into this user specified buffer and give it back. Okay, so, that clear?
Is it different from a sector of this block?
Disk block and sectors are slightly different things. Sectors are a hardware abstraction.
Yep.
A disk block is a software abstraction. Block size can be a sector, but typically block sizes are some multiples of sector, as we will see. Okay, so, this is the disk. OS. Okay, so this is read 1 byte. What happens if you send in a read request for 1 byte, you go and actually read 1 block, which is much bigger than a byte. You put it into a memory buffer. You extract the byte from that memory buffer and then you copy it into buff, which is specified there, and you return that to the user. All of that is hidden from you. You don't know that the OS actually read more data than you asked for, and the rest of it was actually stored in cache. In memory, none of that is visible. Okay. All that is done by the file system. Yes.
Is that memory buffer actually in physical memory, or is that in?
Is that in
I'm
physical
sorry,
memory?
physical memory of the OS?
This is going to be buffer cache is going to be the physical memory of the OS.
Okay.
This is part of the memory that I saw last time when I was showing virtual memory. You saw some pages were wired. They are not paged out. Buffer cache is memory that you don't want to page out. You just read this block from disk. If you swap it out back to disk, the whole point is lost. You're keeping it there so that if subsequent read come, I can actually take that data that I already read and return. So some of these things are going to be hardwired. You're not going to page it. Okay. So that's random. So that's the read call for random access. You can specify an offset and read from any location on disk. You can also do sequential access where you just see where the file pointer is and read the next chunk of data. Very similar, you just don't specify the offset, you see where the file pointer points to, and then read this many bytes and stick it into this buffer. Okay? So this is, remember this is pseudocode, this is not that the file is actually an array. This thing is actually an I/O instruction that goes to the hardware device where it gets back a chunk of data and then you copy it. So the pseudocode here is hiding lots of things and what's actually going on inside the OS. Okay. So write is very similar. I'm not going to worry about it. Neither am I going to worry about memory mapping. We did that earlier. Okay. There's also a seek call, which basically just allows you to change the file pointer to wherever you want. Okay. So typically what most OSs will do is they will not actually have a direct, they'll only have a sequential read call. They may not have random access call, but they will support seek. So if you want to do random access, first you move the file pointer and then you read sequentially from that location. If you want to read from another location, you do another seek. Okay, so you can use seek and sequential access to emulate random access. That's something to keep in mind. Okay, so a couple of interesting side points here. So what kinds of accesses do you typically see as far as user programs are concerned, as far as OS is concerned? Okay. So typically from a programmer's perspective, I/O is either going to be sequential or it's going to be what is called keyed or hashed. Okay. Sequential I/O you already know, that's just reading a whole file sequentially. Very common. Okay. You open a file in an editor. Okay. The OS goes, reads the entire file into the editor's memory, and then the editor displays the entire file to you. Okay, the compiler compiles an entire file. You read the whole file sequentially, compile it, write out a binary object, which is also written out sequentially. Okay. So sequential accesses are fairly common. Many applications just read entire files and or read them sequentially in some smaller chunks. Okay. And but there are many other applications where you are going to actually use keyed access. Okay? Databases are the best examples of this. In databases, you're basically going to try to read a record from some location in a table, which is also stored on disk. Okay? Those are not sequential calls. Okay? You are going to go and basically, typically the call is going to be based on a key. Think of it as a key value pair. Okay? You specify a key and you get a value out. Okay? So database accesses look like this. Database search. If you store a hash table on disk, it's also going to look like this. If you have very large data structures that are hash tables that are made persistent, then you are going to get similar kinds of access. A dictionary search is going to be similar. If you actually write a search engine, then it is going to also do lookups that look like this. The key is going to be a search term, the value is going to be all the matches for the search term. Okay? So that's another common kind of access. So typically, as far as user programs are concerned, now either sequential access or keyed access. Now as far as the OS is concerned, sequential access at the user level is sequential access at the system level, at the disk level. Keyed access at the user level becomes random access at the disk level. Okay? Any keyed access essentially is random access. Okay? The reason this is important to understand is that sequential and random accesses is next time when we talk about file systems, we will actually go back and understand how the file system performs when you have sequential and random access. And we'll see certain kinds of file systems are very good for sequential access, but very bad for random access. And others try to balance both. Okay. So just to give you an example, if you look at FAT file system, you will see that they're better off for sequential access, not so great for random access. And other kinds of file system will do both. Okay. So how to design your file system for these access patterns is something we'll look at next time. But right now, you just keep in mind that you can both do sequential and random. So the next concept is directories. And this also you know, so I'm going to go through this quickly. Okay, so directory is just a collection of files. Okay, so users decide what the directory name is, what is stored in a directory, and so on. The file system doesn't impose any restriction. And typically what you have in most file systems today is what are called multi-level directories. Back in the old days, that was not the case. There were file systems that did not support directories. All the files had to be stored in the root directory. Or there were just two-level directories, okay, which meant that every directory name had to be unique. Okay, clearly, those restrictions were too restrictive. So now you have a multi-level directory. You know, let me draw a picture to show you how a directory structure looks like. Okay, if you take a typical Linux or a Unix file system, you will have a special directory at the very top called the root directory. Okay. This root directory will have some subdirectories like user, bin, home, and so on. Each of these might have other subdirectories. You may have something like local here, bin, and so on. And there may be files. Okay. So you may have something Firefox, ls, and so on. So the way to think about a directory is it's a tree-like structure as far as the OS is concerned. Okay. Any interior node in the tree is a directory or a subdirectory. The leaves of the tree are always going to be files. Because you can't have any structure below a file. Okay, so typically what you get at the very bottom is either an empty directory, and that's the only case where you have a leaf that is going to be a directory, is an empty directory, but typically there's a file in that directory, then you basically have a file, end file that becomes a leaf. So keep this in mind. We'll talk about why this tree structure is important in just a minute. Okay, so as far as users are concerned, you can navigate this tree using a variety of techniques, and we'll talk about a couple in just a moment. But the thing to keep in mind is that this is a tree, and you will see what happens when you let some operations, if you allow some operation, this no longer remains a tree, and that is going to create some problems, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Okay. So one point I want to make is when you open a file, okay, your file system has to do a lot of work of navigating through this tree. Okay. So if you say open, say this one name. So if I just say read foo,
You'll have some notion of path at that point?
yes, sorry, just go down. That's what I'm trying to explain here. So if you just issue a call saying read this file foo, what does the OS have to do? First thing it has to do is so this is called a relative name. Okay, typically you can have two types of names for a file, an absolute name and a relative. The absolute name for this file is, okay, this is the full name of the file. It says home Shemai Foo. That's basically the entire path name to get to that file. Okay. So you either specify this full name or you specify a relative name. Okay. If you specify a relative name, what the OS is going to do is it's going to interpret that name with respect to what is called a current working directory for that process. Okay. Every process has something called a current working directory, CWD. Okay. So all file names are interpreted with respect to that current working directory. So if you are trying to access this file here, the current working directory for the process that issued it better be /home/NY, because this file is actually in there. Okay. So what that means is when you issue this call, it is going to prepend this prefix to the file, whatever the current working directory. CWD is home Shenoy. It is going to take this string and attach it to that string and think that's the file I need to worry about. Okay. Once you get the file name, you are going to actually recursively descend down this tree to look for that file. You are going to start with /. This is called dereferencing or dereferencing the file. So you start with / and say, is there a directory called home in there? Okay, you say yes, then you go into that directory and say, is there a subdirectory called Shenoy in there? You look in there and say, you say yes. Then you say, is there a file called foo in that directory? And then you say yes, and then you actually go and read the file descriptor, file metadata from the disk. So opening a file may involve several disk operations, okay, up to 10, depending on how deeply nested this file is. Several disk cars, and we'll talk about how to make that efficient next time. Not today, but all you need to keep in mind is the directory structure is hierarchical, it's a tree, and then typically that tree structure is used by the file system to navigate and try to get to files that the users have access to. Okay, so now we'll worry about why this tree is important when we talk about a referential name. Okay, so you may have heard about hard links, soft links, symlinks, shortcuts, these stuff. So this is what all of this means. So typically as I said, a typical file has a unique name associated with it. But most file systems allow you to associate multiple names to the same file. Okay? And this is done through what is called referential naming. Okay? There are two kinds of referential naming techniques. One is called hard link, the other one is called soft link. Okay? A hard link is essentially, think of it as giving two names to the same file. Okay? So you have a file, as I said, internally the files are numbered. So let's take file number 100. Its name is A. If you actually do hard links, you can give a second name to that file and you give it name B. Now regardless of whether you access the file as A or B, you are getting to the same file. Okay, so you are now given two names to that file. You can give as many names as you want. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay. Now, so these are two names to exactly the same file. Okay, so what that does is every time you associate a name, it is going to increment what's called the ref count of the file, which says how many names does this file have. And as you start deleting the file, it will decrement each of those names is going to decrement, and when it goes to 0, the file is going to be deleted, and I'll show you that as well. Now, as far as most operating systems are concerned, they will not impose some restrictions on how you create hard links. In particular, they will not allow you to create hard links to directories. The reason they don't allow you to create hard links to directories is if you allowed hard links to directories, you are going to break the tree structure. Okay? Either the tree will either become a DAG, a directed acyclic graph, or worse, the tree will actually have cycles. So in particular, here's an example where you see a tree, what was a tree, but you created some weird hard links and introduced a cycle. So what you may do is if let's say bin is a directory, you will actually, if you go and try to create a bin and make it a hard link like this, you say create a subdirectory called bin in local, but that is a hard link to this parent directory called user. Now you have a cycle in the graph. It is no longer a tree, it has a cycle, and cycles are going to be bad. Okay, so if you have a backup program running, it's going to go into an infinite loop. So it will come here, it will try to back up this directory, which will send it back there, and it just sit and recurse. If you're trying to do recursive descent, you will also go into an infinite loop. Okay. So typically, this is not allowed, because it's going to break our tree structure. Okay. You can create hard links to files, but not hard links to directories. Okay, so, and I'll show you examples in just a second. Okay. The other kinds of referential names are soft, but these are also called shortcuts or symlinks. If you've heard of any of these terms. So this is basically, think of it as not two, it is essentially boils down to two names for the file, but it's effectively a pointer to a file. Okay, so if you had the same file 100 and it had a name A, then you basically, if you want to create a soft link, you say, whenever I try to open file B, go and look up file A. Okay, so in file B, you are not actually going to point to the file, you're just going to add a shortcut, saying it's like a forwarding address, saying if you want to access B, go and actually look at A. Okay, that's called a soft link. Okay. Soft links are allowed in directories, although hard links are not. And this is because if you have a soft link, in most backup programs, they just ignore the soft link. They won't actually traverse. Hard links you can't distinguish. You're forced to traverse. Okay, so if you want to have two names for the same directory, the only way to do it is using a shortcut for a soft link. Okay, otherwise, it doesn't work. Okay, so let me show you some examples. So what we'll do is I'm going to make it a little bigger. Projector is messed up. So first we'll make a file. We'll call it foo. We're going to say oops. Already a file. We'll restart. First we make a file, we write something to the file.
It needs to be in quotation, or hello needs to be in quotations, or else you're trying to write your file hello.
It's not cat, I need to echo it this. Okay, so there's a file called foo. Okay, so if I want to now make a hard link, I'm going to say foo and bar. Okay, so now if I try to actually read bar, you'll get the same thing. In fact, you can verify that these two are the same files because you'll see that they are the same ID. Okay. So if foo and bar actually have the same numbered file, which is a unique file. So these are two names of the same file. Okay. So in fact, now if I actually go and remove the original file foo, okay, you'll see that bar is still there. Okay. Because it just removed a name, it's not removed the file itself. The ref count has actually gone from 2 to 1. Okay, it knows that there's another name for this file, so it's not going to delete the contents of the file.
So when you remove bar, then does it delete the file from disk?
Okay, so I'll show you. So that the file is still there. So if you now remove bar, file is gone. Okay. So that's just hard link. So now I'll just show you if instead of so now this foo is a directory. not a file. And if you now try to do a hard link to a directory, it will give an error saying I cannot do it because it's a directory. Okay? So let me remove the directory. So now we will make another, recreate the old file. So now we have another file called food, and this time we'll make a soft link. Okay, so we'll see that there are now two files, right? And if you actually look at the file IDs, you'll see that there are two different files. Okay, there are two different numbers. This is 222, there's 140. Okay? When you had a hard link, they were actually the same files. In this case, bar is simply a pointer. Okay, as you can see here, if you try to open bar, the file system will be told, go and look at that file and open that file instead. Okay? So as far as most operations goes, it will do exactly the same. If you try to read bar, you will actually go read foo and you'll get the same end effect. Okay? But now what happens is if you actually go and remove foo, which you can, okay, bar is still here. Okay, bar isn't gone, but if you try to now read bar, you will get an error. This is a dangling pointer, because all that bar says is if you want to open this file, go read that file instead. The file system is not tracking whether this file exists or not. It is simply a forwarding address. Okay, so you want to read this, go read that. So if you delete the original file, the forwarding address is still there. Okay, when you try to read it and you try to read foo, basically you have a dangling pointer. Okay, so you get this when you have shortcuts, but you delete the original file, you will have the same issue.
So in the case if you make a new foo, it will again point to it.
Yes, because it could be now a different foo, but this is a forwarding address, right? So it's just going to can actually do that. Okay, so now because it doesn't know what is happening to the original file. Okay, so you can delete it, you can recreate it with a new file, and you still get dereference.
There's still an implicit PWD in front of that food though, right? Like there's still the current working directory in front of that food.
Yes.
But you can explicitly pass from the root one to.
So if you want, you can actually do things like, so you can now make some directories here. First of all, symlinks don't have to be within files of the same directory. You can make symlinks to wherever you want. Okay, so also I'll show you, now if you have foo as a directory, you can actually make a symlink to it. Because this is simply a forwarding address. So in this case, all it says, if you want to open this, go open that. And when the file system comes and opens it, that's a directory, so it goes and opens that directory. Yes.
When you create a link, will it store the full path? So like if I move the link, it'll still be pointing to the right spot I want.
If you move the link, you can try that. You can move.
Symlink to something, and when I move the symlink, it loses track of what it was linked to.
Yes. Because it is not internal, it hasn't stored the whole thing. But if you had created a symlink with a full name, that would be different.
Okay.
So that is referential naming. So there are some subtleties here with respect to hard links and soft links. As I said, when you create hard links, there are two names for the exact same file. Okay, so both names actually refer to the same file. This is just a way of giving multiple names to a file. And soft links basically is more of a pointer to a file. It's not actually pointing to the file. It just says go look up that file, and then you actually have to go and look up the original file. So directory operations I already talked about. We'll talk quickly about protection, and then again I'll show you some stuff. So protection information in the file system allows you to figure out who is allowed access to a file. Okay? There are two types of two ways to do it, or two types of data structures you can use to do it. Okay? What Windows NT has is what is called access control list, or ACLs. Okay? So it's basically ACLs. Okay? And so what you do for each file is you say this is the user and these are the things that this user can do on the file. Every file has a list associated with it. The list of all the users that can do any operation on that file and all the operations that that user can do on that file. Okay. So if you had a file in Windows, you can have an ACL which says, I can rewrite this file, some other user 2 can only read this file, user 1 can write to this file. You can have a list of arbitrary size. This is called the access control list for the file. So when a process actually tries to open this file, you are going to check the owner of that process and compare it against the ACL and see is the owner actually in the access control list. If not, you have no access to that file. And if you do have that access, do you have the right permissions to do whatever operation you are trying to do. So ACLs can be of arbitrary size. ACLs can be nested rather than users. You can have user groups and so on as well. Yes, question.
I find it to be kind of disingenuous to say that it's large achieves to maintain because you can do groups in the ACLs.
That's what I just said. You can actually have groups,
Okay.
but they can be of arbitrary size. Right? There is no restriction. That is just a administrative convenience saying, rather than the administrator going and saying, I will allow these 500 users access to the file, the administrator has created a group consisting of that 500 users and put one entry. That's different from saying that the ACL actually limits the number of entries in the access control list. The access control list can be of arbitrary size. Is that clear what I just said?
Yeah, it is.
So groups are just a administrative convenience that allows you to do specify an operation on a group of users rather than having to name them individually. The OS of the file system is not going to limit how many entries there are. All I was saying is there is going to be arbitrary entries allowed in this ACL. You can add as many groups as you want. You can have as many users, and you can get the same effect by having a group of 500 users or an ACL with 500 entries. Yes, you had a question.
Oh, no, just.
All right. So lists can be large because OS is not going to prevent any or have any restrictions on it. Now what Unix does, the old versions of Unix, not anymore, what they did is they basically approximated this. Rather than saying I'm going to have a list of arbitrary size, is that all users in the system have 3 categories. So we basically, rather than saying that, each file has an owner and a group, and operations on these files are specified based on what the owner can do, what the group can do, and what everyone else can do. Okay. So this is a coarse-grained approximation of an ACL with 3 entries. And this is always an ACL with a fixed size with 3 entries, saying what is the user allowed to do, what is the group that this file belongs is allowed to do, and what is everyone else. And each of these 3 groups of entities can either read, write, or execute on this file. Okay, so you can set a read, write, execute bit for the owner, read, write, execute for the group, read, write, execute for the void. Okay. So this basically allows you to have a fixed size access control list, but it is an approximation. Okay. So if you want two users to do something, the only way to do that is to actually make one user the owner and create a group for that user and specify that, or if the group has more than that many users and you specify that you are inadvertently letting other users do something that you may not have intended to. So either then you have to create a specific group just to allow those operations, or you have to do it some other way, which is just allowing more users access to a file than. Now most recent versions of Unix operating system, so Unix file systems still do this, but they have started supporting ACLs as well, as I'll show you in just a moment. Okay, so this is basically, if you actually do ls minus l, you'll see that that's the permission bits on the file. Okay, so here the owner has the read, write, execute permission, no one else has any permission. Neither the group nor world has any permission. You can of course change that. You can just remove this bar. Just touch. So if you say change mode group plus read write, So now you just added read-write bits to the group, and you can do that same thing to the user and so on. Okay. Now, as far as access control lists are concerned, if you have ext3 or ext4 file systems, they support both. They support read-write permission bits. So if you now, so this, that you can only do on a Unix machine. So that you log in. Okay, so that's created a file foo, and it has read-write execute bit. So if you actually have ext3, if you say get file ACL foo, you see that there is a file list associated with it. By default, the ACL is the same as a read-write execute permission bits, which says the user can do this, group can do this, other can do this. But then you can actually do something called set file access control list. So I know the syntax for. So you can say -m, and then say something. File. To say something about user C. So I have to actually do a man on this and figure this out, but
I think you just set the user right there if you were to dash M user. You can put yourself down because it's going to bark if it doesn't have the right username.
So I have to figure out what the exact syntax for this is. But the point I'm trying to make is this file access lists are no longer even in Unix operating systems, or rather Linux operating systems. You have a file access control list associated with it. Okay, so this can be of arbitrary size, and the reason that is important is when you design your file system, when you associate metadata with the file system, if your file access control list is of arbitrary size, then metadata is also going to be of arbitrary size. Okay? If you just had the read-write execute permission bits, then you know that you have to store 9 bits for file permissions, and that's always fixed. It's coarse grained but fixed, and then the metadata will also be a fixed set. You will have user, size of the file, and then permission bits on the file and so on. Okay? So when we talk about allocating data structures for the file system, this is going to come back and say what happens if the metadata is of arbitrary size. We'll see that there are implications of that on file system design. Makes the design more complicated. If the metadata is now of arbitrary size, there are allocation problems. Okay? So that's protection. So basically we went through the file system API. It says what are the file operations, what can you do, what is referential naming, and how protection information is actually included in the file. Okay. Next time we will actually now go to the next layer, which is the underlying storage layer, and see how the file system is actually managing space on disk. So all of that is going to be hidden from the user, but the OS has to actually deal with it in the file system. Okay. So we will stop here today and then continue this next time.